Hi, Aqua Roomers. Time for chapter reading. Well, yesterday, that was a big adventure. Pa and Mr. Scott dug the well. But if you remember, Mr. Scott had not let the candle go down, and there was a bad gas in the bottom of the well, and Pa had to go down, tie Mr. Scott, and Ma and Pa had to turn the crank, the windlass, and pull Mr. Scott up. Whew, that was a close call. And then I showed you the portrait of my grandfather when he was a little boy, and his family worked in the mines, and he had the cap that had the candle on top. Because a mine is deep down under the ground, like a well that Pa and Mr. Scott are digging. And they had to know if there was a bad gas to breathe, that candle will go out if the gas is bad. So, as Ma said, and as Laura said, that was a terrible day. I don't want a well, Ma sobbed. It isn't worth it. I won't have you running such risks. Mr. Scott had breathed a kind of gas that stays deep in the ground. It stays in the bottom of wells because it is heavier than the air. It cannot be seen or smelled. No one can breathe it very long and live. Pa had gone down into that gas to tie Mr. Scott to the rope so that he could be pulled up out of the gas. When Mr. Scott was able, he went home. Before he went, he said to Pa, "You were right about that candle business, Ingalls. I thought it was foolishness, and I would not bother with it, but I found out my mistake." "Well," said Pa, "where light can't live, I know I can't. And I like to be safe when I can be, but all's well that ends well." Pa rested a while. He'd breathed a little of the gas, and he felt like resting. But that afternoon, he unraveled a thread from a tow sack. We read a little of this yesterday. Tied the powder in a piece of cloth and said to Laura, "I'll show you something." They went to the well. Pa lighted the end of the string and waited till the spark was crawling quickly, and he dropped the little bundle into the well. In a minute, they heard a muffled bang, and a puff of smoke came out of the well. "That will bring the gas," Pa said. When the smoke was all gone, he let Laura light the candle and stand beside him while he let it down, all the way down in the dark. The little candle kept on burning like a star. So next day, Pa and Mr. Scott went on digging, but they always sent the candle down every morning. There began to be a little water in the well, but it was not enough. The buckets came up full of mud, and Pa and Mr. Scott worked every day in deeper mud. In the mornings, when the candle went down, it lighted oozing wet walls, and candlelight sparked in rings over the water when the bucket struck bottom. Pa stood knee deep in water, bailed out bucketfuls before he could begin digging in the mud. One day, when he was digging, a loud shout came echoing up. Ma ran out of the house and Laura ran to the well. "Pull, Scott! Pull!" Pa yelled. A swishing, gurgling sound echoed down there. Mr. Scott turned the windlass as fast as he could, and Pa came up climbing hand over hand on the rope. That means did this to pull himself up. "I'm blamed if that's not quicksand," Pa gasped as he stepped onto the ground, muddy and dripping. "I was pushing down hard on the spade when all of a sudden it went down the whole length of the handle, and water came pouring up all around me. "A good 6 feet of this rope is wet," said Mr. Scott. The bucket was full of water. "You showed sense in getting out of that hand-over-hand, Ingalls. The water came up faster than I could pull you out." Then Mr. Scott slapped his thigh and shouted, "I'm blasted if you didn't bring up the spade too." Sure enough, Pa had saved the spade, so he did not let that shovel go all the way down the quicksand. In a little while, the well was almost full of water. A circle of blue sky lay not far down in the ground, and when Laura looked at it, a little girl's head looked up at her. That was her reflection. When she waved her hand, a hand on the water's surface waved too. The water was clear and cold and good. Laura thought she'd never tasted anything so good as those long, cold drinks of water. Pa hauled no more stale water from the creek. He built a solid platform over the well and a heavy cover for the hole that let the water bucket through. Laura must never touch that cover. But whenever she or Mary were thirsty, Ma lifted the cover and drew a dripping bucket of cold, fresh water from that well. So you know how important water is. Can you imagine if you didn't have any water and you'd wake up in the morning, couldn't brush your teeth, couldn't get a drink, you couldn't even do the dishes or make coffee? Or what if you had to leave your house and go all the way down to the creek and get buckets and buckets of water and bring them back home? That's what they had to do. So having the well is going to make things a lot easier. So there's Ma. So Pa built this whole cover to make it safe. And then anytime Ma needs water, she takes the top part off, lowers the rope, and pulls up the bucket of water. Yeah. That was an exciting chapter. Oh, oh my goodness. This is one about cowboys. This is called Texas Longhorns. And a longhorn is a kind of cow. So if you look at the cows here, see? Look how long their horns are. I know it's hard to see. And that's cowboy. That's a cowboy. Let's read. One evening, Laura and Pa were sitting on the doorstep. The moon shone over the dark prairie. The winds were still, and softly Pa played his fiddle. He let a last note quiver far, far away until it dissolved in the moonlight. Everything was so beautiful that Laura wanted it to stay forever. But Pa said it was time for little girls to go to bed. Then Laura heard a strange, low, distant sound. "What's that?" she asked. Pa listened. "Cattle. By George, it's cattle," he said. "It must be the cattle herds going north to Fort Dodge." So cattle are a large group of cows. After she was undressed, Laura stood in her nightgown at the window. The air was very still. Not a blade of grass rustled. And far away and faint, she could hear that sound. It was almost a rumble and almost a song. "Is that singing, Pa?" she asked. "Yes," Pa said. The cowboys are singing the cattle to sleep. Now, hop into bed, you little scallywag. Laura thought of the cattle lying on the dark ground in the moonlight, and of cowboys softly singing lullabies. The next morning, when she ran out of the house, two strange men were sitting on horses by the stable. They were talking to Pa. They were as red-brown as Indians, but their eyes were narrow slits between squinting eyelids. They wore flaps of leather over their legs and spurs and wide-brimmed hats. Handkerchiefs were knotted around their necks. You could pull them up. And pistols were on their hips. And they said so long to Pa and hi-yip to their horses, and they galloped away. Here's a piece of luck, Pa said to Ma, to help them keep the cattle out of the ravines among the bluffs of the creek bottoms. They wanted Pa to help. Pa would not charge them any money, but he told them he would take a piece of beef. How would you like a good piece of beef? Pa asked. So the cowboys were dressed with the big wide-brimmed hats, and there was a reason for that. The big wide brims would keep the sun out, and also they could turn their hat upside down, scoop it into the creek, and get some water for them or for their horses. And the scarves that they wore around their neck, they could pull up so they wouldn't breathe in all of the dust and the dirt. And then, riding those horses all day long, they wore leather on top of their pants because it was pretty rough, hard work for their legs riding those horses. And the leather was a protection. I bet it would be fun to see a cowboy. And of course, Laura had never seen one before. So, Pa is going to help them, and they'll give him a big piece of beef. Oh, Charles, said Ma, and her eyes shone. Pa tied his biggest handkerchief around his neck. He showed Laura how he could pull it up over his mouth and nose to keep the dust out. And then he rode Patty west along the Indian Trail till Laura and Mary couldn't see him anymore. All day, the hot sun blazed, and the hot winds blew, and the sound of the cattle herds came nearer. It was a faint, mournful sound. It was the sound of cattle lowing. At noon, dust was blowing along the horizon. Ma said that so many cattle trampled the grasses flat and stirred up the dust from the prairie. Pa came riding home at sunset, covered with dust. There was dust in his beard and in his hair and on the rims of his eyelids, and dust fell off his clothes. He did not bring any beef because the cattle were not across the creek yet. The cattle went very slowly, eating grass as they went. They had to eat enough grass to be fat when they came to the cities where people would eat them. Pa did not talk much that night. He didn't play the fiddle. He went to bed soon after supper. And the herds were so near now, Laura could hear them plainly. So we will read more about the cattle and about the beef, and Pa brings home more than just a piece of beef. Until tomorrow, thank you, boys and girls.